In a dimly lit Memphis studio, the hum of old amplifiers still echoes against the walls. The tape spins slowly, and somewhere in that room you can almost hear him. James Carr, a voice so pure, so painfully honest, it could make even silence tremble. He wasn't just another singer from the Deep South. He was the sound of heartbreak turned into prayer, a man who could turn a whisper into a cry for redemption. But behind that golden tone was a storm that no spotlight could ever heal. What happens when one of the greatest voices in Southern soul vanishes not from the stage, but from himself? Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea. Sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the bright lights of Memphis ever touched his name, James Edward Carr was just a preacher's son from a quiet corner of Mississippi. Born on the 13th of June, 1942, he grew up in a home where music wasn't entertainment, it was devotion. His father's voice filled Sunday mornings, preaching of faith and salvation, while young James listened, learning the rhythm of truth long before he learned melody. When the family moved to Memphis, Tennessee, he found himself in a city already pulsing with gospel, blues, and the early heartbeat of soul. It was a place where every corner store had a jukebox, and every back porch could hold a band. But James wasn't drawn to noise, he was drawn to feeling. He joined church choirs not for applause, but to understand what made people cry when a song reached its final note. At just 9 years old, he began singing in local congregations. His voice wasn't large, but it carried something rare sincerity. By his teenage years, he joined small gospel groups across Memphis, most notably the Harmony Echoes, where he learned discipline, harmony, and the sacred power of imperfection. Each note he sang came from the same place his father preached, from somewhere deep, somewhere honest. Those early gospel years carved his identity. While other kids chased baseballs or streetcars, James chased sound, the sound of truth. Standing under flickering church lights, he closed his eyes and imagined himself not as a star, but as a vessel. His baritone was still raw then, but it had that trembling edge, the kind of voice that makes you stop and look up, even if you don't know why. In the early 1960s, Memphis was exploding with opportunity. Stax Records was redefining rhythm and blues, and studios were springing up like wildflowers along Macklemore Avenue. Yet, when James knocked on Stax's door in 1963, he was turned away. His sound, they said, didn't fit. But the rejection didn't break him, it refined him. Somewhere inside, he believed that truth would always find its place even if it had to wait. That belief carried him to a man who would change his life, Roosevelt Jameson. A local songwriter and promoter, Jameson saw what others didn't, a quiet storm behind that humble smile. He became James's manager, protector, and in many ways, his guardian angel. The two men shared a dream not built on fame but on purity, to create music that could make people feel the weight of being alive. By late 1964, that dream found a home at Goldwax Records, a small Memphis label founded by Quentin Claunch and Doc Russell. Goldwax didn't have the big budgets or national reach of Stax or Motown, but it had something better: soul without pretense. Claunch believed in artists who sang from the gut, and that made James Carr a perfect fit. Those first sessions were quiet, almost unassuming. A dim studio, a handful of musicians, and a man who sang as if every lyric were his last confession. He experimented with styles, bits of pop, touches of blues, searching for the perfect balance between gospel purity and human vulnerability. Somewhere between those late-night takes, his voice began to find its purpose. Outside the studio, Memphis was buzzing with civil rights marches and cultural change. Inside, James sang of love, pain, and the ordinary struggles of Southern life. He was becoming the reflection of his time, the sound of a region balancing faith and heartbreak. In those moments, before the world knew his name, James Carr was already shaping something timeless. He wasn't chasing trends or chart positions. He was chasing emotion, the raw, unfiltered truth of the human soul. Years later, critics would call him one of the greatest pure singers of Southern soul. But back then, he was just a young man walking home under the glow of Beale Street lights, clutching his notebook of lyrics and dreaming of the day his songs might matter to someone. Before the fame, before the pain, Before the darkness that would one day follow, there was just a boy in Memphis, singing like he could touch heaven if he closed his eyes hard enough. By 1965, James Carr had become a familiar face inside the narrow hallways of Goldwax Records. The studio was nothing glamorous cracked tiles, a faint smell of cigarette smoke, and equipment that had seen better days. But for James, it was sacred ground. This was where honesty lived, where imperfection wasn't a flaw but a fingerprint. He spent long nights recording song after song, searching for the tone that could carry both his gospel roots and his human sorrow. Some tracks leaned toward Motown pop, others drifted closer to blues. None of them felt completely right. Jameson would sit behind the glass window, nodding softly, never rushing him. "You'll know it when it happens," he used to say, and James believed him. During those sessions, Carr developed a ritual. He'd dim the lights, stand close to the microphone, close his eyes, and hold the first note just a moment longer than expected, like he was testing if the room could handle what he was about to give. Musicians said they could feel the air shift when he sang. There was no acting in his voice, no pretense. Every word sounded like it had been lived first, then sung. The producers at Goldwax weren't sure what to do with him. His voice was too emotional for radio-friendly pop, but too refined for the raw juke joint crowd. Yet, Claunch and Jameson knew they had something special, a singer who didn't perform songs, he experienced them. In late 1965, they cut several demos that would quietly redefine Memphis soul. Songs like Love Attack and Coming Back to Me Baby showed flashes of brilliance, but Carr still hadn't found the song that would become his breakthrough. He was patient, though. For him, success wasn't about charts or fame. It was about that one perfect take, the one that made everyone in the room go still. Jameson often reminded him, "You don't chase the song, James. You let it come to you." And then, one humid Memphis night in early 1966, it did. The song was called "You Got My Mind Messed Up." From the first verse, everyone in the studio knew something different was happening. Carr's voice cut through the air like confession, tender, pleading, drenched in emotion but never out of control. When he hit the final line, there was silence. The kind of silence that feels holy. That recording became his first major hit, breaking into the top 10 of the R&B chart. For Goldwax, it was validation. For Carr, it was revelation. He finally understood what he was meant to do, not just sing about love, but live it in all its pain and beauty. In that small Memphis studio, surrounded by flickering fluorescent lights, James Carr had found his sound, the voice that would one day define him as one of the greatest pure singers of Southern soul. After the success of You Got My Mind Messed Up, James Carr was no longer the quiet singer in the corner of the studio. For the first time, people started saying his name with reverence, whispering it alongside Otis Redding and Percy Sledge. But while fame began to knock, James remained grounded. He still rode the bus across Memphis, still carried his lyric notebook in a worn-out coat pocket, and still sang as if he were inside that little church in K, Mississippi. Goldwax Records, thrilled with their new star, wanted to capture lightning twice. In early 1966, Carr returned to the studio to record what would become the defining moment of his career, The Dark End of the Street. Written by Dan Penn and Chips Moman, the song told a story of forbidden love, of people hiding from judgment and themselves. For most singers, it was a love song. For James, it was prophecy. When he stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. His eyes stayed closed the entire take. Every word came out slow and trembling, as if it cost him something to let it go. There was no theatricality, no flourish, just a man confronting the loneliness inside his own soul. When the final note faded, the engineers didn't speak. Dan Penn later said it was the most honest take he'd ever heard. The Dark End of the Street wasn't just another R&B single. It became the anthem of hidden sorrow, a song that sounded like heartbreak itself. While others covered it later, Aretha Franklin, Clarence Carter, even Linda Ronstadt, none captured the quiet devastation of Carr's original. It was the sound of a man who didn't just sing about pain, he understood it. Following that success, Carr's first album, You Got My Mind Messed Up, was released in 1966, featuring Love Attack, Pouring Water on a Drowning Man, and Coming Back to Me Baby. Critics would later call it one of the purest Southern soul albums ever made. Simple, direct, and emotionally flawless. Yet even then, James wasn't chasing critics. He was chasing connection. He once told a session player, "If a song can make one person feel less alone, it's worth singing." By 1967, Carr had everything an artist could dream of: critical acclaim, chart presence, and the respect of his peers. Yet inside, something began to shift. The exhaustion from constant touring and recording started to wear on him. He was often quiet, withdrawn, and unpredictable. Roosevelt Jameson, always protective, noticed the change. James would sometimes disappear after shows, wandering alone for hours. He'd return exhausted but smiling, as if nothing had happened. Behind that smile, however, the storm that had been gathering for years was starting to move. The very sensitivity that made his voice transcendent was also what made his heart fragile. Each song demanded that he reopen old wounds, and after a while, the bleeding never really stopped. Still, in those years between 1966 and 1967, James Carr created something immortal. His voice became the measure of sincerity in soul music, the place where gospel met confession and pain found beauty. He didn't know it yet, but he was standing at the edge of his brightest light, and just beyond it, the shadows were waiting. By 1966, James Carr had become the quiet miracle of Memphis. In an era when soul singers were larger than life, he was something different, restrained, humble, yet powerful enough to stop a room with a single note. The radio waves were filled with noise and flash, but when James's voice came through the speaker, the world seemed to slow down. Goldwax Records, still a small label fighting for recognition, suddenly had its first real star. "You Got My Mind Messed Up" was climbing the R&B charts, and critics began to take notice. They described his voice as hauntingly intimate, as pure as a gospel prayer. Quentin Claunch, the label's founder, couldn't hide his pride. "James didn't need a full orchestra," he once said. "All he needed was a heartbeat." Inside the Goldwax studio, the atmosphere had changed. Musicians came in quietly when James was recording. They knew something special was about to happen. He would stand close to the microphone, head tilted slightly down, eyes closed, as if in communion. When the first note left his lips, even the soundboard seemed to hold its breath. Between late 1966 and 1967, James released a series of singles that defined the Southern soul sound: "Love Attack," "Pouring Water on a Drowning Man," and "A Man Needs a Woman," each one drenched in passion and precision. There was no performance trickery, no studio polish. What you heard was raw humanity, framed in melody. Audiences felt it instantly. His concerts across the South became emotional gatherings rather than entertainment. Women wept quietly in their seats. Men stood frozen, clutching their programs, unsure why they were moved so deeply. James never shouted, never demanded attention. He just was. The honesty of his voice demanded everything else fall silent. Despite the growing acclaim, Carr stayed untouched by ego. He refused to act like a star. After shows, he often wandered off alone, disappearing into quiet corners or taking long walks through the city. Reporters tried to capture him for interviews, but he preferred to speak through music. When someone asked him once what he wanted people to feel when they heard him sing, he said simply, "Something true." 1967 became his defining year. His performances at small Southern venues in Jackson, Birmingham, and Memphis turned into near-religious experiences. Backed by simple bands, he delivered songs that felt more like confessions than compositions. There was no separation between the man and the music. When he sang about love, it was love in all its pain and imperfection. Even the musicians around him were changed by the experience. One drummer recalled, "You could hear his voice through your skin. It wasn't loud, but it carried something heavy, something you couldn't shake off." In that brief, golden stretch, James Carr stood at the very heart of soul music, not as its loudest or most famous voice, but as its truest. Goldwax had become a sanctuary, and James was its preacher, singing the gospel of heartbreak to anyone who would listen. For a man who never chased fame, the world was finally catching up to him. His voice, tender, weary, eternal, had found its place in the American soundscape. And for a fleeting moment, it seemed that James Carr had everything he'd ever wanted: peace, purpose, and the purest expression of his soul. For all the glory that surrounded him, James Carr was never built for the chaos that came with fame. By late 1967, the road began to wear him down. Long nights, sleepless bus rides, the endless demand to perform it all began to blur together. For most artists, applause was oxygen. For James, it was noise. Roosevelt Jameson, who had managed him since the early days, noticed the change first. James had always been quiet, but now his silences were different, deeper, heavier, like he was trying to escape a room no one else could see. Some nights, he'd sit in hotel lobbies long after everyone had gone to bed, staring out at the streetlights, humming fragments of gospel hymns under his breath. During one tour stop in Birmingham, the signs became impossible to ignore. He walked off stage mid-performance, leaving the band confused and the crowd in stunned silence. Hours later, Jameson found him sitting behind the theater, his head in his hands. When asked what happened, James whispered, "I just couldn't find the song anymore." It was the first real glimpse of a battle that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The diagnosis was never official back then. No one in the industry talked about mental health. But those close to him understood that something far deeper than exhaustion was happening. His moods swung between stillness and sorrow. At times, he was vibrant, charming, full of stories. At others, he'd retreat into himself completely. Jameson tried everything: prayer, rest, space, but the pressure kept building. Even in the studio, where he'd always found peace, something began to shift. Engineers noticed he struggled to focus during takes. Sometimes he'd drift away mid-song, eyes glassy, lost in thought. And then, just as suddenly, he'd return, delivering a performance so perfect it brought everyone to tears. It was as if he was walking a line between two worlds, one that adored him and another that quietly pulled him away. Still, when he sang, the magic never left. His 1967 recording of "A Man Needs a Woman" was proof of that. The song's pleading tone mirrored his life, a man grasping for connection while slowly fading from view. Every syllable carried weight, every pause felt like confession. Even as his spirit fractured, his artistry became more profound, more haunting. Goldwax Records, though proud, was beginning to struggle. Without major distribution or marketing, they couldn't compete with giants like Atlantic or Stax. James's fragile health only complicated things. Claunch and Jameson walked a tightrope, trying to protect him while still keeping his career alive. The world saw success, the records, the acclaim, the voice that could outshine almost anyone. But behind the scenes, the walls were closing in. The very sensitivity that gave his music its power was also tearing him apart. There's a photograph from that time, James standing alone in a spotlight, his eyes half closed, microphone in hand. To the audience, it looked like serenity. But to those who knew him, it was something else entirely: the calm before the storm. By the end of 1968, James Carr had reached the height of his career. His voice was stronger than ever, but his heart was beginning to slip beyond reach. What no one realized then was that his greatest battle was no longer in the studio or on stage. It was within himself. By 1968, the light that had once made James Carr shine was beginning to dim. His voice still carried the same breathtaking purity, but behind it lived a growing silence, one that no melody could reach. Friends and bandmates began to notice it in small ways: missed rehearsals, sudden disappearances, long stretches of isolation after shows. What had once been a gentle quietness was turning into something darker. Goldwax Records, already struggling financially, tried to keep his career afloat. Quentin Claunch believed that another hit could pull James back from the edge, so they booked a series of recording sessions throughout 1968. But something had changed. Some days, James arrived at the studio in good spirits, laughing softly with the musicians before delivering takes that felt transcendent. Other days, he barely spoke, staring off into the distance, lost in thought. Roosevelt Jameson, still both his manager and guardian, was the only person who could reach him. He made sure James ate, rested, and stayed away from the chaos of the road. But even Jameson could sense that the man he'd once protected was slipping further away. "You could tell," he said later. "He was there, but he wasn't." The turning point came during a session at Muscle Shoals in 1969. The studio, known for its warm, earthy sound, had hosted legends Wilson Pickett, Aretha Franklin, Clarence Carter. Everyone expected the same magic from Carr, but when the tape started rolling, something was off. He sang one song, "To Love Somebody," then fell silent. He didn't storm out. He didn't collapse. He just stood there, eyes open, expression blank as if his spirit had suddenly left the room. The musicians waited, unsure what to do. After a long pause, Jameson gently guided him out of the booth. The session ended quietly, without anger or drama, just the sound of a man who couldn't find his way back to himself. That moment became a haunting metaphor for everything James was going through. His mind, once a vessel for raw emotion, was now a maze. Depression had wrapped itself around him, stealing his focus, his energy, even his will to sing. In 1969, as Goldwax faced bankruptcy, a deal was nearly struck with Capitol Records to buy out Carr's contract. But when executives learned of his declining health, the offer vanished. For James, it was more than a financial loss. It was confirmation of what he'd feared most, that the world was moving on without him. By 1971, he signed briefly with Atlantic Records and recorded a single track, "Freedom Train." It was a song about hope and release, but it would be his last for years. The lyrics, "I'm just waiting for the freedom train to carry me home," sounded less like ambition and more like prayer. When the tape stopped, James sat in silence. For the first time in his life, the studio, his sanctuary, no longer felt like home. The years that followed were like a long shadow stretching over James Carr's life. After 1971, the man who once carried the voice of Southern soul disappeared almost completely from the public eye. For nearly a decade, he sang rarely, recorded even less, and lived quietly with family in Memphis. The world had moved on new trends, new stars, but for those who remembered him, James was still the one who could make heartbreak sound holy. It wasn't until 1977 that a flicker of his old fire returned. Roosevelt Jameson, who had never stopped believing in him, coaxed him back into the studio for a small independent release on his own label, River City Records. They recorded a single called "Let Me Be the One," and though it didn't make the charts, it was proof that James was still alive, still capable of reaching that deep, trembling truth when the microphone was turned on. The voice was older, maybe a little rougher, but the emotion was intact, fragile yet eternal. Encouraged by that moment, Jameson arranged a tour in 1979. The destination was unexpected, Japan. Over the years, Japanese soul enthusiasts had developed an almost spiritual devotion to James Carr. His records had become collector's items there, passed hand to hand among die-hard fans who believed he was the truest voice in American soul. They invited him to perform a chance at redemption, perhaps even rebirth. When James arrived in Tokyo, he was met not with fame, but with reverence. People greeted him as if he were a prophet returning home. For the first few days, he seemed calm and focused. He smiled more, spoke softly with musicians, and even rehearsed with a quiet confidence. But on the night of the show, something went wrong. He had taken too many antidepressants to calm his nerves. When the curtain rose, James stood at the microphone, motionless. The band began to play "The Dark End of the Street." The audience waited, breath held, but he never moved. His lips parted slightly, his eyes vacant, as if he were caught between two worlds. The song went on without him. When it ended, there was silence, not confusion, not disappointment, just sorrow. The fans understood. They applauded anyway. That performance became legend not for its brilliance, but for its tragedy. It was the embodiment of James Carr's life. Beauty and pain intertwined so tightly that one could not exist without the other. After returning to Memphis, James retreated even further from the world. He lived with his sister, mostly indoors, often detached from his surroundings. Neighbors would see him sitting by the window, listening to old gospel stations on the radio. Some days he hummed along. Other days, he didn't seem to recognize the music at all. Those who loved him refused to call it an ending. They saw it as a long rest, a soul too pure for the noise of fame, finally seeking quiet. By 1980, the name James Carr had faded from the airwaves, but not from memory. For those who had heard him, his voice remained like a ghost, gentle, aching, unforgettable. By the early 1990s, it seemed the story of James Carr had quietly ended. For years, he had lived in near silence, a legend spoken of only in whispers among record collectors and soul historians. His name appeared occasionally in liner notes or radio dedications, but for most of the world, he was gone. Yet somewhere deep in Memphis, a small spark remained. Roosevelt Jameson, still loyal after decades, refused to let that spark die. Along with Quentin Claunch, the same man who had first believed in Carr back in 1964, he decided it was time to bring James back to the studio. They had no illusions of chart success. This was about legacy, about giving a voice that had once moved mountains the chance to speak again. In 1991, they reunited under a revived Goldwax label and began recording what would become Take Me to the Limit. The sessions were modest, no big budget, no label executives hovering, just a handful of musicians who grew up on James's records. The man who walked into the studio was no longer the bright young soul singer of the 1960. He was older, slower, and visibly tired. Yet when the microphone warmed, something miraculous happened. The tremor in his voice was still there, but so was the depth, the kind that comes only after surviving heartbreak and time. Those who were present said the first take of the title track felt like a resurrection. Carr didn't sing like he was trying to prove anything. He sang like he was grateful to still be able to. The album wasn't perfect. Critics later called it uneven, sometimes fragile. But even in its imperfections, there was something sacred, a man rediscovering himself through the same gift that once nearly destroyed him. Not long after, Carr returned to the road. He performed at small soul festivals in the United States and Europe, where die-hard fans treated him with reverence. To them, he wasn't a comeback story. He was living proof that authenticity never dies. Audiences described his shows as intimate, humble, and heartbreakingly beautiful. When he sang, one fan said, it felt like time stopped. In 1994, James released what would become his final album, Soul Survivor, under the Soul Tracks label. The title couldn't have been more fitting. Against all odds, through loss, obscurity, and illness, he was still standing, still singing. The voice wasn't as smooth as it once was, but it carried the weight of everything he'd endured. Every crack, every breath told a story. Critics, who had long considered him one of the most underrated voices in American music, praised the album for its honesty. It wasn't the sound of a man chasing the past. It was the sound of a survivor acknowledging it. James Carr's return wasn't about fame. It was about closure, a final act of grace from an artist who had given everything to his music. For those who listened closely, Take Me to the Limit and Soul Survivor weren't just albums. They were farewells, quiet, dignified, and filled with gratitude. James Carr passed away on the 7th of January, 2001, in Memphis, Tennessee. He was 58. The news didn't make national headlines. There were no magazine covers, no televised tributes, just a few lines in local papers, a handful of obituaries written by critics who had never stopped believing in him. Yet, for those who truly knew soul music, it felt like the end of an era. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. Across America and overseas, tributes began to surface, small but sincere. College radio stations replayed The Dark End of the Street in his honor. DJs in London, Tokyo, and Paris dedicated late-night sets to his memory. For younger listeners discovering him for the first time, it was as if they had stumbled upon a lost gospel. Music journalists began writing about him again, calling James Carr the soul singer's soul singer, the man who had given everything to emotion, even when it cost him everything else. Rolling Stone reissued an old review of You Got My Mind Messed Up, describing it as one of the most honest albums in American music. In England, Mojo magazine ranked him among the top 5 most underrated vocalists of all time. But nowhere was his legacy more deeply felt than in Japan. The same fans who had once witnessed his silent Tokyo performance in 1979 now organized tribute concerts in his name. At small clubs in Osaka and Shibuya, Japanese musicians covered his songs with reverence, treating them as sacred texts. To them, James Carr represented something rare, the voice of truth in a world of performance. In the United States, a slow reawakening followed. Record collectors began rediscovering his early singles, trading first pressings of Goldwax Records like precious relics. Reissue labels released remastered versions of You Got My Mind Messed Up and A Man Needs a Woman, bringing his music to a new generation of soul enthusiasts. Each release was accompanied by essays describing not just his sound, but his story, the triumph, the pain, the silence, the redemption. Artists who came after him, from Al Green to Solomon Burke, from Percy Sledge to newer neo-soul voices, cited him as influence. They spoke not only of his technique, but of his sincerity. Carr's voice, they said, taught them that soul wasn't about volume or fame. It was about truth. Even Hollywood, decades later, began to acknowledge the quiet genius of James Carr. His songs appeared in independent films and documentaries, often underscoring scenes of loss and human longing, the very emotions he had lived through. Today, when people speak of James Carr, they no longer talk about what he lost, but what he gave. A blueprint for vulnerability in art. He proved that a voice doesn't need to be perfect to be unforgettable, it just needs to be real. He was never the loudest, never the richest, never the most famous. But in every way that matters, James Carr became eternal. His records remain a testament to the beauty and burden of feeling too deeply, a reminder that even the quietest souls can leave the loudest echoes. Somewhere in Memphis, an old recording studio still stands. The walls are cracked, the paint is faded, and the microphones haven't been touched in years. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear him, that trembling baritone, that voice that carried both salvation and sorrow. James Carr's story isn't just about what he lost. It's about what he gave: honesty, the kind that doesn't fade with time. He sang for people who'd been broken, who'd loved too hard, who'd prayed and still felt alone. Every note he recorded was a reminder that pain, when sung with truth, becomes something beautiful. He never had the luxury of fame or fortune, but maybe that's what made him special. He wasn't chasing the world's attention, he was chasing meaning. When he sang "The Dark End of the Street," it wasn't just a song about love gone wrong, it was a reflection of himself, standing in the shadows, trying to find his way back to the light. In a culture that often celebrates the loudest voices, James Carr proved that quiet ones can leave the deepest mark. His legacy lives not in numbers or awards, but in the hearts of those who felt that chill when his voice hits the first note. Today, long after the lights of Goldwax went out, his music continues to travel through radios, record players, playlists, and memories. Somewhere, someone is hearing him for the first time. Somewhere, someone is realizing that soul isn't a sound, it's a truth. So when you think of the legends of soul, Otis Redding, Sam Cooke, Percy Sledge, remember James Carr. Remember the man who didn't just sing about heartbreak, but lived it, survived it, and somehow turned it into grace. And if this story moved you, don't let it end here. Let's keep his memory alive, one voice, one story, one song at a time. If you believe in giving forgotten legends their flowers, please like this video, leave a comment, and share your favorite James Carr song. Let me know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to Stars Underrated for more stories of the artists the world forgot but music never did. Because some stars never fade. They just shine where fewer eyes can see.